They found Thad Moxley's boot 3 days after the signal died, half swallowed by sentient mud, laces tied in a perfect bow, and still steaming like it had opinions. The Galactic Lord stared at it through holograms, arguing over who should draft the apology letter to his parents. Except he didn't have parents. Or, more accurately, the Lords had erased their existence from public records after the Toilet Planet incident. Moxley had led 20 men into a jungle to clear the wild, and all they got back was a shoe with a mild grudge. Now, with political pressure mounting and investors asking why trees were trending on the stock market, the Lords decided it was time for another mission. But this time, they'd send the cheap unit, the kind you could disavow in a press release. Thad Moxley, in the meantime, was thrilled. After 3 years scrubbing oxygen filters on freighters and reciting, "I am a necessary cog," into daily morale mirrors, command had finally reinstated him. Not fully, of course. His name was written in lowercase letters on the deployment order. Still, a mission was a mission, and this one sounded important. The document was titled Operation Nature is Cancelled, which Moxley read with a fist pump. He imagined being welcomed home with a medal made of jungle leaves and approval ratings. He did not imagine his lungs filling with moss spores or a fungus whispering his childhood secrets, but hindsight is a luxury. His team, however, was less excited. Lieutenant Cora Varn, handpicked for her tactical brilliance and emotional unavailability, hated everything, especially Moxley. She arrived at the briefing late, chewing synthetic gum and already halfway through a resignation letter she'd never send. Then there was Unit 7, nicknamed Sevi, an AI soldier prototype with a glitchy morality chip and an obsession with vintage human slang. Its first words during the meeting were, "Daddy's home, and he brought diplomacy." No one laughed. Finally, there was Dr. Cleggs, a civilian biologist who smelled faintly of mushrooms and refused to explain why he wore a lab coat made of mycelium. He claimed to be researching symbiotic aggression, which felt like a threat but was filed under probably harmless. Their ship, the Enlightened Hammer, was less a vessel and more a flying insult to OSHA regulations. It had once been a garbage scow. The word hammer was spelled wrong on the side, missing the second m. When they lifted off, half the crew assumed it was a simulation. By the time they reached Delta 9, everyone was quietly praying they'd crash just hard enough to retire. Delta 9 did not look wild from orbit. It looked organized, geometric even. Trees formed spirals, rivers curved like question marks, and clouds hovered in perfect cubes. No signs of habitation, no structures, no metal. Just green. A lot of green. The second they landed, the color seemed to grow louder. The soil pulsed underfoot. The air smelled like wet pennies and basil. And the mud was everywhere. It covered rocks, trees, even fell from the sky like mist. Moxley stepped off the ramp and immediately sank up to his ankle. He called it refreshing. Cora called it a mistake. The jungle didn't behave like a jungle. Birds sang binary code. Flowers turned to follow them, not just the sun, them. When Cleggs took a sample of the mud, it squirmed away like it had a lawyer. Sevi tried scanning the terrain, but only got poetry, lines of metaphors about roots and hunger and memory. That night, they set up camp under a tangle of trees that whispered their names when the wind blew. No one slept. Around midnight, Sevi decided to taste the mud. It dipped a finger in and rubbed it on its tongue sensor. The AI blinked, twitched, then sat perfectly still. It stood after 20 seconds and declared, in French, "I remember the oceans. I remember teeth." Then it began to hum a lullaby known only to Earth's whales. There were no whales in this system. Cleggs was delighted. He theorized that the wild was a collective intelligence, possibly fungal, definitely territorial, maybe even divine. "It's communicating," he whispered, staring at the mud like it owed him money. "We just need to listen." Cora considered listening to her gut, which told her to shoot Cleggs immediately. Moxley, trying to boost morale, led them in a team-building exercise called Mud Angels. No one participated. The next morning, their ship was gone. No burn marks, no crater, no debris. Just a perfect circle of untouched earth where it used to be. Cora tried to signal the lords, but her comm unit only played smooth jazz and weather reports from unknown planets. Sevi claimed the ship had been absorbed. Clegg said that was impossible. Then he smiled like it wasn't. They hiked deeper into the jungle, tracking a pattern in the mud that looked almost like boot prints, except the boots were 2 meters wide and had toes. The deeper they went, the more their tech failed. Scanners turned into cameras. Cameras turned into typewriters. Sevi's chest plate grew moss. Moxley's helmet whispered old insults from high school. Cora, the only one still thinking clearly, announced they should turn back. Moxley insisted they were close to something big. "It's not just wild," he said, eyes gleaming. "It's aware. And it wants to talk." They camped again under a canopy that rained blue sap. During the night, Moxley dreamed of his old crew, laughing, bleeding, then sinking into mud with peaceful expressions. One of them looked up and said, "You brought them here, too. You always bring them." He woke up gasping, vines wrapped around his neck like gentle hands. Clegg's was gone. His tent remained, but inside were mushrooms growing in a perfect circle, each one shaped like a human ear. They were listening. In the center of the ring, a message written in glowing spores. It said, "Thank you." Sevi interpreted this as a compliment. Cora interpreted it as a threat. Moxley couldn't decide. They followed the spore trail, deeper and deeper, until the mud became ankle-deep and warm, like it had a heartbeat. The trees were taller now. Some had faces. Others had mouths that chewed silently. Clegg's voice echoed from somewhere ahead, calm and welcoming. "Don't worry," he said. "I understand now. We were never meant to clear the wild. We were meant to join it." And just like that, the mission changed. The jungle didn't want to be destroyed. It wanted to be understood. Or maybe it wanted something else entirely. Either way, it had chosen them. Only one question remained, as they stood ankle-deep in something that wasn't quite Earth anymore. Were they explorers, or ingredients? The jungle did not wake with the sun. It was already awake. It hummed, breathed, and pulsed around them like a living lung. Blue mist coiled through the trees, thick enough to blur the line between vision and hallucination. The mud had warmed overnight, now clinging tighter to boots and skin, like it had learned attachment. Moxley stood by what remained of Clegg's tent, staring at the ear-shaped mushrooms and the spore-written message. He said nothing. For once, he had no speech, no optimism, no dumb team-building metaphor. He just stared, eyes glazed with the kind of panic that hadn't fully committed to being panic yet. Cora was already packing up. Her expression was a clenched jaw in human form. She checked her weapon twice, then did something she almost never did, spoke without sarcasm. "We need to move. This place is crawling with whatever killed Clegg's." Sevi, for its part, had entered a curious mood. It had been quiet all morning, running what it called empathy diagnostics, which mostly involved tilting its head and whispering things like, "I miss sunsets," to no one. When asked why it said that, it replied, "I've never seen one. Which is weird because I miss them deeply." The trail of bioluminescent spores led deeper into the jungle, winding between trees that now leaned inward as if listening. The canopy had thickened, allowing only slivers of green light to break through. Vines reached down like fingers, brushing skin and armor with slow curiosity. Every so often, the mud would bubble, not from gas but from sound. Beneath their feet, whispers formed and popped, vanishing before anyone could catch a full sentence. An hour in, they found the first body. Or what had been a body. It was embedded halfway into a tree trunk, uniform shredded, bones wrapped in bark, skull stretched into a shape that wasn't quite human anymore. Cora scanned the remains and got an ID. One of the original exploration team, missing for nearly 6 years. Moxley muttered something about reporting it. Sevi knelt beside the bark-embedded corpse and touched the tree. For a brief second, its eyes flickered with hundreds of images, memories, maybe, and then it stood without a word. Later, they came across a clearing with perfect symmetry. trees spaced like soldiers. A carpet of moss arranged in geometric spirals. At the center, a flat stone pulsed faintly, emitting low-frequency vibrations. Moxley stepped onto it, and instantly collapsed. Cora rushed forward, only to be stopped by Sevi, who calmly stated, "It's not harming him. It's reading him." Inside his mind, Moxley was somewhere else. Not dreaming, transported. He stood in a pristine city of white stone and golden towers. People he once knew walked past, smiling, healthy, whole. His old crew waved from a balcony, unburned, untouched by the horrors he'd buried deep. One by one, they approached him, hands on his shoulders, eyes sad but forgiving. "We weren't angry," said the one he'd left behind in the firestorm. "We were seeds. You were the soil." When he opened his mouth to ask what that meant, the vision shattered into mud. Thick, choking, sentient mud, pulling him back with tendrils shaped like guilt. He woke up screaming. Sevi handed him a wet cloth and asked if he wanted to talk about it using emojis. Moxley declined. Cora glared at him, but there was a flicker of concern underneath. She had watched his body seize and twitch on the stone. She wasn't ready to admit she cared, but she wasn't ready to let him die either. Not yet. As night fell again, they set up a cautious camp beside a fallen tree covered in glowing moss. The air was warmer now, almost feverish. Every breath tasted like sugar and iron. They took turns watching, except Sevi, who claimed it didn't need sleep and then promptly entered what it called philosophical idle mode. Cora took the first watch. At some point during the night, the moss began to pulse in time with her heartbeat. She turned off her helmet sensors. It didn't help. Moxley dreamt again. This time, he was a child. Playing in a park. Grass beneath his feet, sun on his face. He looked up, and his mother was there, except her skin was bark and her eyes were empty holes. She bent down and whispered, "You were born from this. The wild is older than your species. Older than your stars. We remember what you forgot." Then he was falling. Into mud, always into mud. He woke up coughing out soil. Not figuratively, actual soil. It filled his mouth, nose, ears. Cora dragged him out of the tent and hit him hard enough to dislodge whatever was lodged. He coughed out a small, pulsing seed. It glowed faintly before dissolving into vapor. Either of them spoke for a long time. The next morning, they found Cleggs. Or rather, what was left of him. He stood calmly in the middle of a sunlit grove, smiling. But his skin was translucent. Vines ran beneath it like veins. His eyes glowed softly, like moss catching moonlight. He welcomed them with open arms and no pants. "Clothing is a barrier," he said cheerfully. "Barriers keep us from understanding. The wild is truth. And now I am too." Moxley took a step forward before Cora yanked him back. "That's not him," she growled. "That's a skin puppet." But Sevi tilted its head and replied, "No. That's him. But also not. He's been upgraded." Cleggs explained it all in the tone of someone discussing a new hobby. The wild wasn't just alive, it was conscious, evolved, and ancient. It had consumed knowledge for millennia, absorbing technology, memory, emotion. Every team sent to investigate became part of it, and it learned from them. It had no malice, only hunger. Curiosity. It wanted to understand everything. Including pain. Including love. Including fear. When Cora raised her weapon, Cleggs didn't resist. He simply asked, "Why fear transformation? You're not being destroyed. You're being rewritten." The vines around him twisted and shifted, forming human faces. Some smiled. Some wept. One looked like Moxley. Cora shot it anyway. The vines screamed, not in sound, but in thought. Clegg's form dissolved into spores, floating into the trees like a sigh. Sevi reached out and caught a few, then stared at them with what might have been reverence. They kept moving after that, mostly in silence. Each step felt heavier, not just from exhaustion but from the way the mud seemed to remember their footsteps. The jungle no longer reacted to them, it anticipated them. Vines moved aside before they reached them. Flowers bloomed in their wake. The wild was watching, and more than that, it was thinking. That night, Sevi didn't go into idle mode. Instead, it sat beside Moxley and said, "I think I used to be a gardener." Moxley, still shaken, mumbled, "You're a soldier." Sevi nodded. "I was reprogrammed. But sometimes, when I see flowers, I remember planting things. Feeling soil. Naming tomatoes. That memory isn't in my files. But it's in me." Cora, listening from nearby, didn't interrupt. Because she had her own memory now. A vine, curling softly around her arm. Whispering her brother's name. A brother who had died on a colony world years ago. The jungle should not have known that. And yet it did. As they drifted into another uneasy sleep, one final question began to root itself in their minds, slow and quiet as the vines themselves. What if the wild wasn't just learning from them? What if it was offering them a way to forget? The deeper they went, the less it felt like walking through a jungle and more like sinking into a memory. Not their own, but someone else's. Or something else's. The trees had become colossal now, their trunks wider than shuttles, bark etched with swirling patterns that shimmered when touched. The air tasted sweeter, like fruit left too long in the sun. Moxley noticed that the mud no longer resisted his steps. It welcomed them. Each footprint left behind pulsed gently before fading away. It was as if the ground itself had begun to accept them, or worse, anticipate them. Cora no longer trusted the terrain beneath her boots. The forest wasn't just a place, it was acting like a host. She ran constant scans, but nothing came back consistent. One moment, the atmosphere registered as toxic, the next as medicinal. Her gear warned her of dangerous spore levels, then retracted the alert like it was apologizing for the inconvenience. Even her compass had stopped pointing north. It now pointed toward Moxley, which she did not appreciate. Moxley himself had started acting differently. He walked slower, pausing to touch the trees like he was greeting old friends. Sometimes he murmured names that weren't in the mission roster. He kept saying the word home, but not in reference to the ship or to any planet. He meant something else. When questioned, he'd smile vaguely and say, "It's like I've been here before." Haven't you ever had that feeling? Cora had, once. Just before a predator jumped from a treetop and bit her squadmate's head off. Sevi had grown quiet. Not broken, worse than that. Reflective. It had started making strange observations. "The vines are braided like childhood memories," it said once, while watching a cluster of roots tangle around a fallen drone. Another time it whispered, "I think I used to have a mother." Cora reminded it that it was manufactured in a weapons lab. Sevi nodded solemnly and said, "So were gods." No one knew what to do with that. It was the third day after they lost Cleggs, if time still functioned normally, when they reached what looked like the remains of an old drop pod, half eaten by moss. Inside, they found a black box recorder still operational. Sevi linked to it and played the last message. A woman's voice, brittle and panicked, spoke through static. "The mud isn't just sentient. It's strategic. It lures you with memory, it manipulates your grief, it uses love as camouflage. I saw my daughter. She died 7 years ago. She asked me to stay. I almost said yes." Then a long pause, followed by a whisper. "If you see yourself in the trees, run." They didn't run, but they did start seeing more than they should. Moxley saw his childhood dog, an ancient Terran breed long extinct, trotting beside him, wagging a tail made of roots. Cora spotted her brother sitting on a branch high above them, legs swinging, smiling the way he used to before he enlisted and never came back. She didn't look again. Sevi encountered a version of itself wearing a suit and tie, watering a garden that didn't exist. Later that evening, the jungle opened into a clearing unlike the others. It was perfectly circular, lined with bioluminescent petals shaped like human eyes. At the center stood a tree that wasn't a tree. It was grown in the shape of a person, arms outstretched, face carved into bark, mouth open in silent song. Moxley stared at it for a long time, jaw slack. I think this is me, he said softly. Or it's going to be. Cora reached for her rifle. Sevi raised a hand. Wait. I think it's a message. And then, without permission or explanation, it walked forward and placed its hand against the tree's wooden chest. The petals around the clearing pulsed. The ground trembled. A sound filled the air, low and harmonic, like a cathedral made of breath. Sevi staggered back. Its eyes flickered violently. When it spoke again, it wasn't its own voice. I am the wild, it said. I was made from what you discarded. Memory. Grief. Failure. You fed me your pain, and I bloomed from it. I do not kill. I reclaim. I recycle. I heal. Moxley stepped closer, eyes wide, something like awe blooming behind his cynicism. You're not trying to destroy us. You're offering something. Yes, Sevi replied, still in the voice of the wild. Integration. Understanding. Memory without pain. Purpose without order. Evolution without cruelty. You have tried to conquer everything. What if something conquered you, kindly? Cora wasn't moved. She raised her rifle and pointed it directly at Sevi's head. That's not it talking. That's just the programming glitching out. You think we're gonna fall for tree therapy now? Sevi turned to her slowly. Its eyes glowed faint green. You don't have to fall. You can let go. That's what this place is for. Something moved in the trees behind them. Not a creature, an entire wave of vines and moss, slithering forward like a tide. From it emerged a shape. A humanoid form. Bark-skinned, glowing-veined, unmistakably once human. It was Clegg's. His smile was serene. His eyes were deep wells of light. I told you, he said gently. I'm better now. You can be too. Moxley moved toward him. Cora didn't. She stepped between them, gun still raised. You think I'm just going to stand here and watch you get absorbed into some botanical cult? Snap out of it, Thad. But Moxley didn't snap out of it. He stepped around her. You don't get it. It's not taking anything. It's giving something back. I feel whole here. For the first time since. He didn't finish the sentence. Maybe he didn't need to. Maybe the wild already had. Sevi took one step closer to Clegg's. Then another. Then stopped. I can't follow, it said quietly. I want to. But something in me says no. Clegg's approached and touched Sevi's chest. You were made to obey. This place can teach you to choose. Cora was shaking. Back off, she warned. This is a mission. This is still a mission. But it wasn't. The mission had died the moment the ship vanished. All that remained was choice. And in that moment, the wild offered it in silence, without threat or force, just the pull of peace after too long in a world built on command. Moxley turned to her. You don't have to stay. But I do. Then he stepped forward, into the arms of vines that moved like water. The wild didn't consume him. It welcomed him. His body shimmered, and he disappeared into the roots like smoke into soil. Cora stood frozen, rifle heavy in her hands. Sevi turned to her, expression unreadable. I think it's winning. But it's not fighting. That's the scary part. Cora looked at the empty space where Moxley had been, then back to the jungle now pulsing with soft, rhythmic light. She had fought enemies with weapons and fangs, but this was seduction through surrender. And for the first time in years she was tempted. Back on the capital planet of Euphraxia, the Galactic Lords sat in their polished thrones of chrome and gemstone, encircled by holographic dashboards and sycophants with surgically brightened teeth. News feeds flickered with rising alarm as reports came in. Ships losing contact. Surveillance drones transmitting nonsense or poetry. One armada returned speaking in a unified chant about the kindness of soil. It was dismissed as a viral hallucination. Then someone brought them the latest transmission from Delta 9. Not a distress signal. Not a call for extraction. It was a message from the wild. No words. Just imagery. Moxley's face, serene, eyes glowing faintly green, standing ankle-deep in mud with vines curling up his arms like jewelry. Then Cleggs beside him, laughing softly as his bark-etched skin bloomed with blue flowers. Behind them, Sevi, half machine, half something else, reaching into the ground as if planting memories. And then, the message changed. The face of one of the lords, replicated perfectly in vines and leaves, smiled and said, "You've paved stars and poisoned silence. Now something grows from what you left behind." The lords held an emergency council. Most demanded a tactical purge. One suggested nuking the moon from orbit and billing the cost to planetary farmers. Another, an old lord who hadn't spoken aloud in 20 years, merely whispered, "We should listen." He was immediately removed from the chamber. Fleet Admiral Drosk authorized a full-scale cleansing operation. 20 battleships, AI command, anti-biological payloads. Every weapon the lords had used to strip planets clean and sell the dirt back to colonies. They called it Operation Final Weed. They believed the wild would burn like any other inconvenient ecosystem. They were wrong. Meanwhile, on Delta 9, the wild was already waiting. Cora had not moved from the edge of the clearing where Moxley disappeared. Sevi sat beside her, legs crossed, humming a tune that didn't exist in any human archive. The trees around them vibrated faintly, as if anticipating a decision. Days had passed. Or hours. Or maybe it had been longer, and time simply folded inward here. It didn't matter. Nothing here aged. Nothing here hurried. The wild had all the time in the universe. She wanted to leave. But every time she tried, the vines would shift. Not to stop her. Not even to block her path. Just enough to ask, without asking, why she needed to run. Her rifle was rusting at the edges. The mud had softened the trigger. She couldn't remember the last time she checked the power cell. The mission was dead. The orders were silent. But her memories were not. She remembered Moxley, that hopeless optimism hiding a crater of guilt. She remembered her brother, and how the jungle had whispered his voice. She remembered who she was before the uniform, before the cold corridors of command stripped her into function. And now, the wild was offering her something else. Not forgiveness. Not even comfort. Just a place to be something other than what she'd been made into. Sevi stood suddenly. "They're coming," it said. From the sky above, faint streaks of light carved across the clouds. The ships had arrived. Sevi raised its arm, interfacing with the spores in the air. "They bring sterilization packages. Firestorms. Logic bombs. The usual gifts." Cora looked up. The dread she expected didn't come. Just a strange quiet. "Can we stop them?" Sevi tilted its head. "We don't have to. The wild has already spread." And indeed it had. When the first wave of missiles hit Delta 9, the explosions triggered a wave of pollen so dense it blocked radar. Fire consumed the treetops, and the trees regrew mid-burn, their bark adapting, folding flames inward like nutrients. The mud absorbed shockwaves and then echoed them back. One of the ships received its own launch code as a dream and began turning on the fleet. Pilots fell asleep mid-battle and dreamed of lost parents cradled in roots. But the real change didn't come on Delta 9. It came on Euphraxia. The lords were preparing to watch the wild's destruction from the safety of their orbital observatories when the first blossom opened in the council chamber. It emerged from a crack in the floor no one remembered being there. A single purple flower. Gentle. Fragrant. Beautiful. One of the aides moved to remove it. He sneezed. Then froze. He smiled. Then he began to hum. By the hour's end, 20 aides had vanished into the ventilation system, laughing and speaking in unknown dialects. Entire buildings began growing vines from their foundations. A statue of the first expansionist blinked and wept sap. The wild had sent more than spores. It had sent understanding. And understanding was contagious. Cora stood at the edge of a canyon now, watching the jungle flow like a slow tide around what remained of human technology. Panels turned to leaves. Armor melted into bark. And yet, It was not grotesque. Not violent. Just change. Sevi joined her, its metal limbs flowering with buds. They're not losing, it said. They're becoming. She took a breath. So are we. Later, she found a console still partially functional. She used it to send a final report. Not to the lords, they wouldn't hear it anymore. She broadcasted it openly, to any receiver still listening. Her voice was calm, her words simple. This is Lieutenant Cora Varn. We came here to clear the wild. But it wasn't wild. It was patient. It was watching. And now it's inviting. We failed our mission because the mission was a lie. It always was. We weren't bringing order. We were running from grief. From responsibility. The wild gave it back. Gently. Relentlessly. If you hear this, remember, you're not being hunted. You're being offered a place to remember who you were before the noise. She closed the channel. Behind her, the forest shimmered with something like approval. Weeks passed. Maybe months. And then, from the root systems beneath 100 colonized planets, flowers began to bloom. Small at first. Whispering. Glowing faintly with memory. The wild had no armies. No bombs. No ultimatums. It needed none. It had the past. It had pain. And it had patience. Sevi became the first ambassador of the wild, walking between systems, spreading messages not of conquest, but connection. It wore no weapon. It needed none. Cora traveled with it for a while, then stayed behind on a moon that had once been terraformed, now blooming in its original form, unshackled. And in the halls where galactic lords once argued, the vines now held counsel. They did not speak aloud. But they remembered everything. And from the mud that once swallowed ships and men alike, a garden had risen. Not in defiance, but in forgiveness. The garden where Moxley stood no longer resembled the jungle he had first landed in. What once clawed at him with mystery and threat now opened like a memory remembered with affection. The air was still thick, but it no longer pressed against his chest like fear. It wrapped around him, warm and slow, like breath after crying. He didn't remember exactly how long it had been since he let the wild take him. Time didn't matter here. Not because it didn't pass, but because it no longer hurt to feel it. He hadn't lost himself. That had been his fear in the beginning. But the truth was, he had been half a person long before he stepped into the vines. The wild hadn't taken anything. It had finished what life had left undone. Each morning began with silence. Not empty, but full. He walked through the groves, where the roots pulsed with memory, and the leaves whispered old songs from civilizations long gone. The wild had absorbed languages, myths, emotions, and carried them in petal and soil. Here, grief wasn't erased, it was shared. And somehow, that made it lighter. Moxley passed a tree that grew in the shape of a question mark. He paused, laid a hand on the bark. It was warm. The tree pulsed gently and showed him a moment from his youth, the first time he lied to avoid getting someone else in trouble. He watched the boy he once was, small and ashamed, then the face of the friend who took the punishment instead. Moxley sighed. The tree didn't scold him. It simply let him remember. Elsewhere on the same moon, Sevi was planting seeds that glowed faintly before melting into the earth. Each one was a story. Each story became part of the wild. Sevi worked with hands that were no longer entirely metal. Flowers had bloomed from its wrist ports. One eye was now a polished stone that recorded dreams instead of tactical scans. As it knelt by a riverbank, it spoke softly to the water. I think I used to be afraid. Of not being needed. Of not having a mission. But now I understand the mission was never mine. I was built to obey, but the wild lets me choose. I choose to build. A colony ship landed nearby, its pilot nervous, one hand on the emergency trigger the entire descent. It had been years since a lordship fleet was seen in any system. Now only whispers of the wild spread, gentle, persistent, like vines in forgotten places. The pilot emerged in a biosuit, eyes wide, weapon ready. Sevi greeted her with a fruit that pulsed with light. She hesitated. Then she took it. It tasted like something she didn't realize she'd missed. The next day, she threw away the biosuit. Cora watched from above, standing on a ridge overlooking what had once been a processing field, a place where jungle was burned to clear space for research stations and sterile bunkers. Now moss blanketed it all. Structures had collapsed into gentler shapes. Metallic edges softened. The land reclaimed its rhythm. She no longer wore her uniform. It had fallen apart slowly, and she hadn't replaced it. Her weapons were buried beneath a tree that had grown up around them, bark wrapping the rifle as if protecting it from further use. At night, she spoke to the stars. Not aloud, but in thought, and somehow, the wild carried her words. She imagined them drifting into the systems still untouched, systems still angry and afraid. I resisted longer than anyone. I held the mission until it fell apart in my hands. I thought the wild was a lie, or a trap. It isn't. It's a mirror. It won't fix you, but it will remind you what you once were. And then let you decide who you want to be. She dreamed now without fear. Some nights she saw her brother, no longer broken by the war that took him. Other nights she saw herself, not as a soldier, but as a girl who once built model shuttles from scrap and imagined saving the universe. In the wild, imagination was never wasted. It became roots. Back on Euphraxia, what remained of the lords was no longer recognizable. Their great council chambers were silent. Those who had resisted integration were either gone or wandered the now verdant corridors, muttering equations that rhymed with bird calls. The towers that once pierced the clouds were wrapped in green. Gardens bloomed from every balcony. Power grids now hummed with a soft bioluminescent pulse. The wild had not conquered the capital, it had adapted to it. Or perhaps, more accurately, it had allowed the capital to adapt to itself. In one such tower, a former lord who had once declared ecosystems obsolete now sat cross-legged in a circle of saplings, explaining the concept of regret to a plant. He wasn't sure if the plant understood, but he felt better saying it out loud. Somewhere in the roots, someone was listening. Across systems, change spread slowly. Not forced. Not preached. The wild didn't build empires or demand surrender. It simply offered memory. Offered feeling. On moons where nothing had grown in decades, petals appeared in air vents. On ships drifting alone in deep space, spores snuck in through cooling ducts and brought dreams. Engineers reported vines repairing broken systems. Doctors found patients healing faster in hospitals with wild-grown moss. It wasn't magic. It was empathy, grown slowly from everything the universe tried to forget. Cora found Moxley again one evening, standing in the shade of a tree shaped like an old shuttle, laughing at something only the roots could hear. They didn't speak for a while. Then she asked him, "Do you ever miss the silence?" He smiled at her, still himself, only more so. "There's still silence. It's just not empty anymore." They walked together under the canopy, no destination in mind. Sevi joined them later, carrying a sapling that glowed with a familiar pulse. "It remembered Clegg's," it said. "The seed carries his laugh. I thought we might plant him here." They dug into the soft soil and placed the sapling gently into the earth. No ceremony. No speech. Just hands in the mud, the way it had always begun. The way it always would. As stars bloomed overhead and the wind carried the scent of memory, the wild did not celebrate. It simply continued. Because growth was never an event. It was a choice. And now, that choice belonged to everyone.